always spit your gum out. I hear the sound of like the ocean lapping slowly. Now it's part of the adjusting.
I was sticking my gum under the desk. I did it one time, and then Victoria got it on her pants, and she was like, what? She's like, Alex, come on. Everything's a journey. Welcome to The Racket. We have a special guest today at a special point in his life and the life of local journalism ecosystem in New York City. This is Ned Berke.
It's a very special moment.
It's a very special moment.
One I'll remember forever.
Yeah. So can you tell me why this moment is so special in not only your life, but in the local journalism ecosystem of New York?
Sure. Why it's special in my career. My life is bigger than my career. Why it's special in my career is beginning of February 2019. Up until Friday, I was the editor-in-chief of the Brooklyn Eagle, which for me had been a dream job. Actually, it was something I always wanted to do. I always loved the idea of the Eagle and what it was and could be. And then, like I said, on Friday, all that ended. I and my team were laid off.
And what was that? Was that a shock, or you had kind of seen it coming, or what was that experience like?
Unfortunately, the industry is the nature of the industry is that if you've been in it for a little while, you know that when you take a job in journalism, that first day of the job, you are beginning to prepare for the last day of the job. So I always knew it was a possibility. What truly surprised me was that the team was cut, that three really talented people and people who were very critical to the organization's continued success and dedicated to that success were cut.
You kind of put Brooklyn Eagle on the map, and I'm not saying that to blow smoke. First of all, what was your plan when you came into the Brooklyn Eagle? What state was it in when you got there? What was your goal, and what do you think you managed to do?
Yeah, well, thank you. When I had come to the Eagle, the Eagle existed. It launched in 1841. The second editor was Walt Whitman. It was one of the most respected newspapers throughout its history up until 1955, when it shut down amid a strike. It was revived by its current publisher in 1996, I believe, and from that year until this past year, I would say it largely existed as a community newspaper for Brooklyn Heights, downtown Brooklyn, and the court system, the municipal offices that are all down there. And I was actually brought on because the publisher, in consultation with other people who were interested in growing local journalism in Brooklyn in a time of deep and significant cuts, wanted to take it beyond those communities and be the publication for Brooklyn, be a metro publication for a city of 2.6 million people that it had once been, and to kind of reclaim some of that grandeur. And I think that's sort of what helped put it on the map. I mean, Brooklyn Heights is a very interesting and fascinating community, but one of the issues with any kind of community or hyperlocal journalism is if you don't live in that community, you don't care much about it, whereas Brooklyn as a city, as an idea, as an entity, everyone sort of cares about.
As a philosophy.
It's a global
almost,
brand, right?
Yeah.
As a philosophy, yeah.
The branding of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what we set out to do, and we expanded the news team, but it was mostly by kind of reallocating people within the company. there was some hiring that replaced people that had been there, replaced staffers who were there before I got there. We basically were looking for stories that transcended any individual neighborhood. We didn't want to get into hyperlocal. There were lots of other publications that did hyperlocal very well, Brooklyn or Brooklyn Paper, BK Reader, I could keep going. We wanted to find more thematic stories that really showed how Brooklyn and how New York City worked, and kind of reflected the culture of what was going on.
Because it's interesting that, immigration, what's going on with immigration in Queens right now is pretty distinct from what's going on in immigration in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And the different courthouses, the different DAs in the city, it's like every borough has a different plan for how they treat people in prison, how they treat people in jail, how they're going through the justice system. It's such an interesting thing to be all in the same city, to have Eric Gonzalez and his Justice 2020 plan as the Brooklyn DA, and then that being in somewhat, at least in public contrast with the whatever kind of on the political spectrum Cy Vance is. The sentencing is different. A friend of mine who's works in the criminal justice system was telling me, if you steal a package from a residential building in Manhattan, it's more likely that you're going to get sentenced harsher as the violent felony that robbing any residential not facility, but home or building is, than you would if you were in Brooklyn, because it's widely just sort of like plead out or whatnot. And the practices of the different DAs give each borough a different flavor, and it's just so interesting. And sometimes hyper local news can miss the more large sweeping themes. Like, what is the commonality? What are both people worried about in Brooklyn Heights and East New York? I mean, I'd be hard pressed to answer that question like this, but those are things that kind of are important to keep communities worried about the same thing or interested in the same thing. Yeah,
and I mean, I would say when you start talking about it more thematically, it's not necessarily what are the commonalities between Brooklyn Heights and East New York, but how do you make an East New York issue make sense to someone in Brooklyn Heights, and relatable to someone in Brooklyn Heights. And I think one thing that kind of speaks across everything, and I think it's the undercurrent of every story that happens in New York City in 2019 and 2020, is the affordability crisis. Brooklyn Heights might be one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, but they still think about the affordability crisis, and it affects them very differently. But when you can start relating that to criminal justice, to housing justice, to education justice, it wasn't something made explicit in everything that we reported, but it became to be very clear to me that is what is, kind of essential to the Brooklyn experience right now, and probably to the New York experience too.
What do you see that you did there that you want to continue in some way?
Yeah, so I mean, we had only just been approaching our stride, I think, at the Brooklyn Eagle. 2019 was planting a lot of seeds. We were starting to see really what worked. We did a lot of kind of experimentation. One thing that very clearly worked in 2019 was, one, stop treating readers like idiots. Two, stop pumping out cheap content because you need lots and lots of volume to throw on Facebook and get traffic back. Facebook doesn't work like that, and certainly reader stickiness doesn't work like that. And when we started valuing what the readers wanted and speaking to them intelligently, and giving them more depth and thoroughness and explanation and context in their news, they were coming back, and we saw that in the numbers.
So your numbers were going up.
Oh, our numbers were going up. We were when I came to the Eagle, it was the fifth place, news outlet in Brooklyn. When I left the Eagle, actually within 6 months, we became the first place. And in that 6 month, it was by a lot. It's sort of that hockey stick growth kind of leveled out a little bit, but we always kind of remained top of the pack. And in total for 2019, we were top. But I didn't care about page views, and actually that's something I said on the first and last day of my job there. What I cared about was seeing that readers were coming back, and as someone who has some background in analytics and metrics, that was something I was watching for and tracking every month. And I mean, we saw 188% growth in the amount of readers who came back more than once a month.
Right.
And we saw 160, I believe, 160% growth in people who were coming back multiple times a week. That's really good growth. That's what you want to see, because that's
like
a
sustainable growth.
audience,
Yeah,
and you're getting people who give a crap about news and an information habit. Then what are the best like outdoor cafes? You know?
Right.
Which is a great service too. It's just, you know, it's not something that I think underpins.
Well, there was a print
Society.
Like you guys had print.
Yeah.
A print newspaper, the Listicle, and I do believe the Listicle could be an art. That's a whole separate sort of thing. I believe that there is some sort of strange beauty that is unexplored to a certain extent in the Listicle, but it's, to me, something that I want to digitally consume very particularly, and it's something that I want to consume not necessarily in my news feed. You know, it's more of it's just a different thing. And I think that's why you see all these papers breaking off their branded Listicle sections. For some reason, I can't remember the name of any of them because I don't actually read them. But like sometimes I would. And I have read the funnier ones in BuzzFeed, Refinery 29, and definitely the snarky ones that came out in like Gawker and stuff.
Yeah.
So I do think there's like nuanced room for the Listicle, but I don't know if it's side by side with news necessarily. Anyway, that was a tangent.
I actually think it can be. I mean, to me, that's just a format. You
Right.
know, that's not what I mean when I say respecting or not respecting like the audience's intelligence. It's the information contained therein. Like I actually tried to get my news team to think about and experiment a lot with like what an article is. Do you need you know, lead deck quote and then a whole bunch of context? You know, what can you make shorter? What can you link out to? What can you put in subsections? You know, what does it actually need to be the most effective communicator of information?
But you guys had not really started branching out into visual media yet. I mean, you had photographers.
Yeah, we had photographers. We had some really, we have, you know, some really, well, I don't have. They have some really good photographers. Paul Frangipani is amazing. Mark Davis, who
Paul came by here.
worked with us on freelance, was also incredible, and there were others as well.
You had mentioned that you had worked at or you had invented a Sheepshead Bay newspaper.
Yeah, it wasn't a newspaper; it was a blog. So I mean that was sort of my start in thinking beyond just writing stories. And certainly when I started it was just writing stories, and it was not intentionally a business. It was I had been working in trade publications at the time because it was the only job I could find, and I needed a creative outlet. You know, I set about, it was 2008. 2008, there were a lot, like every neighborhood seemed to have its own publication except Sheepshead Bay, its own blog, the blogosphere, which is a word I always hated. And a lot of that have since died away. You know, Twitter and the Facebook newsfeed and all those things came just after 2008 in terms of like actually being a force. And people didn't need to kind of have their own, you know, WordPress or Blogspot set
You just
up.
had to have a bunch of followers on another platform.
Yeah, and it was much easier to get followers back then. You know, it was actually not a well thought out idea. I just, you know, I said I want to do this. And I gave myself 2 hours to get the website set up, get the domain, do whatever design I was going to do, and have my first article published. And I did it, and it was named Sheepshead Bites. I probably should have thought more about the name. I didn't.
I think my first podcast was literally called Stupid.
Yeah. And actually, as someone who had been born and raised in Sheepshead Bay and always wanted to get away, it was meant to be this kind of like snarky, and it was this snarky thing to make fun of this neighborhood that I felt trapped in and stuck in and very culturally different from.
Wait, where in Sheepshead Bay did you grow up?
Right in the heart of it, a block from the train station.
Wait, what train? Is that the D train?
At times it had been the D train, but it's the BQ.
Oh, it's the BQ now. Wait,
Yeah.
but how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I am 35.
You're 35. I'm.
That's right.
So I think we're of a similar age. I'm a little bit older than you, but did you go to high school in the city or did you go to high school in Brooklyn?
In Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn.
Yeah, which is part of the city.
Right. I mean,
I know.
it was all referred to back then because I went to LaGuardia.
Yeah.
So my friends who lived in Sheepshead Bay took that hour and a half or
Yeah.
hour sometimes, hour to an hour and a half commute into the city to go to LaGuardia. And we all were like, oh, are you in the city or are you out of the city? And back then, and it is now strange to talk about it that way since I'm so like the whole city,
Yeah.
I'm whole city forward. But when we just didn't think about it back then.
Yeah, neither did I. And every now and then I still refer to it like that, and then I wince. But my friends still do it. But I'm like, I live in Brooklyn. That's Manhattan. We
Right.
are all the city, and there's no such thing as an outer borough.
I don't know. One could argue that Staten Island is still an outer borough, just because
There has to be an exception to create a rule, right?
there has to be an exception to create a rule. And can one call Yonkers our true outer borough?
No, that's New Jersey.
Right.
Yeah.
I had this map that had been like made in the 60s or 70s. I wish I could find it again. It was one of these like very cute old little New York guidebooks, and it had, the sun, New York, Saturn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just the best thing. I had it framed for a little while, and I took it out for some reason and lost it. But it was basically New York is the center of the universe.
Yeah.
So one could.
I mean, there's like parts of that philosophy that I also like ingrained into the Eagle Style Guide, which is, you don't say, the outer boroughs. You don't say, if you ever need to refer like that, you would say Brooklyn and the other boroughs. Or we rarely said the 5 boroughs. It's Brooklyn and the other boroughs.
Right. That's good. Brooklyn and then everything else.
Yeah.
Harry always referred to me as like the Manhattan kid with a Brooklyn name, but I had mostly grown up in Brooklyn until I was about 14, at which point we moved to Greenwich Village. And it was strange because we were downgrading from Brooklyn, like the house in Brooklyn, to in the 90s where, at least in my family, counter to everything else, we lost a giant chunk of money. We were downgrading to this rent control apartment that some ne'er-do-well or another had always lived in my family. And we had decided, like, all right, well, we'll give up the bigger space in Brooklyn and we'll move into the city because we have less money, which was which is just like a completely counter narrative to what else was going on in the 90s. And it's strange that now, coming back around, people in the city who are living in small spaces are like, well, maybe I can pay a little bit more to live in a nicer area in Williamsburg. Like, I hear that all the time. People who have scraped to, like, get by on the Lower East Side or Chinatown or Two Bridges, where the rents are hugely expensive, they want to pay the same rent or a little more even to go to Williamsburg or, like, some of those North Brooklyn popular areas.
Yeah.
And I once got really offended that somebody had asked me, I had asked for Splenda, I think at Blue Bottle in Greenpoint, and he was like, oh, you Manhattan girls, which it was defensive in its own way, but I was just like, Manhattan? I was like, you've never even been outside like New Brooklyn, which is what we, called the 3.
No, I got it. Yeah, I got it. I've been there too.
It's weird, the chips on the shoulder with the language and the geography, especially in the city. It's like really just very nuanced.
Yeah, it's very fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I've got 3 older brothers, and the psychology that comes with that of always kind of like, digging in on one another and like I love you way, but like I'm gonna make you wince with something
Right.
I'm about to say. It reminds me very much of how neighborhoods and boroughs work in New York City.
Right. So sorry, where were we? The business of journalism. So like, what are your goals now, considering your experience?
Yeah, no, my goals are to continue building on my experience. I mean, so I had started that publication, and I actually contributed to a model that worked at that time. Sheepshead Bites was profitable in terms of its own model, which was giving me an income and a decent income. And I sold that to Corner Media, which became Brookliner. The model at the time, and I still see this in a lot of places across the country, was a lot of really quick, cheap news, a lot of press release rewrites, a lot of police blotter, but the police have given all the information in a 4-sentence email, and you add a bunch of words to it to try and make it an article without doing much more. And then like restaurant openings and closings, and that's it. You just pump that out. I mean, at Sheepshead Bites, it was me and like a part-time writer, and we would do 11, 12 stories a day some days. And then like, we felt good about ourselves because we also did, made sure we had one good article a day that was, something that came out of the community board or some local conflict or whatever. And I felt like, except for that, the thing that made us feel good, all of those other things, or many of those other things, some of it provided a service. Someone does have to kind of go through the press releases and figure out what the community actually knows, because there's a lot of crap and you got to sort wheat from chaff. Chaff from wheat, whatever. But I felt, I left over time feeling like I had kind of poisoned the industry, because I helped establish a model that ultimately I ended up finding very boring.
Just like the turning, the quick turn.
Quick turn, yeah.
I felt that way with video a lot of time in the era of just like, clip this, let's get it out,
Right.
That's why I had...
Feed the beast.
Right.
Feed the feed.
Feed the feed.
Yeah.
Feed the feed. I always said, it's just so maddening to go to like work really hard on stuff that you think is, that you're trying to make beautiful and cool within the confines of this absurdly dry retelling of whatever happened that day. And then you're just feeding it to this ephemeral feed, like river that flows to nowhere through Twitter.
Yeah.
And then you go mad and build cardboard sets for your friends to come talk to you on.
Well, for a while it did go somewhere. So, I mean, I actually do think it's not just like the journalism industry that is totally at blame here. I do actually think the platforms deserve, like, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally created part of this problem, which is in like 2009 to 2012, Facebook, Twitter has never been a huge beast outside of, media people talking to other media people. But in terms of reaching the general public, Facebook was just a flood of traffic for anyone. So the more we created, didn't matter what it was. I would take screenshots of the CompStat reports every week, because they rewrite the file, so you can never get into the archive. And I would post that on the website, and that was valuable because I created an archive of it, and actually a lot of like academics and people would reach out to me for it. But I'd post that on Facebook, and I would get traffic, and it didn't hurt us,
Right.
But the algorithm over the years has made it so that things like that actually do hurt you. And so after I left Corner Media, I was like, I'm never going back into local news. And instead I got involved in the local news ecosystem, which I loved. Before I left Sheepshead Bites, I had helped create Lion Publishers, local independent online news publishers, which is a bunch of bootstrapped online-only local news publishers across the country. It's about 200 publishers and growing. And the only conversation, it's not the only, the major conversation that they have is around business.
Yeah.
It's
sustainable business, how to keep people's jobs.
A lot of people come from having been laid off at their local newspaper, and they went and started up their own thing. So they get the editorial, they don't get the business side. And so Line was founded to help that. And that experience, first I went into a startup where we were trying to build a revenue tool that would help media. I'll just kind of put that aside for a moment. But then I ended up at the Town Knight Center at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, or the Craig Newmark Graduate School of
Craig
Journalism.
Newmark.
And the Center for Cooperative Media out of Montclair, where I had this really kind of fascinating view of media. I was working with the world's largest media companies at Town Knight to have the people who were sitting at kind of the intersection of audience and product. So that's basically editorial, tech, and business.
Right.
And overseeing like the gap between these two things, editorial and business, and getting them to talk to one another. And I just got to listen to the conversations and the experiments that they were trying, the amount of money that they were spending to figure out little problems.
How to make money and how to
make audience that supports journalism.
Right.
The actual mechanism of making money, it's almost easy when you figure that out. It's not really easy,
Right.
but when you figure out how to get the right audience.
So many people are abandoning the advertising model right now because news is not TV. Especially in a digital era, TV is like I don't watch TV, but news is not TV. And so everyone started shifting very quickly to the subscriber model and trying that out in paywalls and things like that. Do you have any, I know this is a really huge theme, but what are, as far as like predictions about what's working, what isn't working as far as that kind of model goes?
Yeah. So where I was going with my story was that the opportunity had opened for both with my knowledge and where the industry is now, which is this idea that like, oh, there's subscriber or reader revenue or something on the table. I can go back and fix some of the mistakes I made at Sheepshead Bites. And we could do that kind of focus on quality and how would that impact the audience. I think to answer your question, I think that's it. I think the kind of pullback from the social media platforms and the quick audiences that they give you really it's giving us this opportunity, although some would say the migraine, of having to really think about what makes an audience stick, what makes a reader stick, how are we serving the audience. Subscriber revenue is a result of that. And I think a lot of people run to that, but it's not the only solution. I think subscriber revenue is like not ever, people will get subscription fatigue, they'll get membership fatigue. I know this holiday season, my inbox was just crushed by news organizations being like what we do, give us $1.
Right, right.
And your dollar will be matched with another $1.
Right. I get like so many newsletters. It's kind of insane. But then also, and you should subscribe. And if you like news, you should pay monthly for it. And
so, I think there's no sign yet of subscriber fatigue, but I think it's coming. But the model it's built on, the audience model it's built on, the editorial model it's built on it gives me great optimism because it works for advertising and it works for events and it works for all of these other different revenue streams because it's based on the idea of to put it in a really crass way, a loyal customer, someone who comes back over and over again. No business survives. That's not true. Most businesses can't survive on someone who just comes and shops once and never comes back again. But people who...
we are on Canal Street.
Yeah.
That sort of is the business model here. But outside of Canal Street, Right.
So the idea that people keep coming back is key. And they have to be well served. And they have to be well served by journalism.
Is there kind of anything that you can leave us with that, like where you're headed and where we can look for the next kind of thing you're gonna take over and do? Is it going to be Sheepshead Bites Redux?
No.
Or?
No, look, I mean, the trajectory of my career,
I mean, like,
sort
do you
of
wanna...
accidentally and now purposely, is that I like to kind of be on the front lines of where things are changing in the model of journalism. Sometimes that's in supporting the ecosystem, so people are learning those lessons
Right.
and transforming kind of at scale. Or it's at a particular publication. I hope to continue that.
So you're thinking to continue work in a particular publication or as like a support?
I don't know.
You're not sure?
Yeah.
Well, either way, I assume there's a lot of people there because of your work at the Brooklyn Eagle that are going to be following kind of what your next move is.
I hope so. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. And look, come for the interview or interrogation and stay for the newspapers.